So I'm Adam Pryor. I can't find it now. So Adam graduated in 2012 and published his dissertation as God Who Lives, Investigating the Emergence of Life and the Doctrine of God. And it's a wonderful book. I'm really grateful to be able to give you a taste of it tonight. I really recommend you looking at it because he sets up a very different agenda for talking about the God-world relation than the usual what we do in theology in terms of, say, creation and grounded being. Because he really focuses on the God, that the idea of God as living and not just as God as the source of existence. So let's explore his book briefly, if you'd like. Okay, anytime. You're good at stuff. Yeah, everyone doing well?
Yeah, I was having the same problem.
That's true.
It's happening.
The antivirus was killing the book. So, here's an overview. Christian theology has affirmed throughout its history that God is a living God. But what does it mean that God lives? What does it matter to say God lives? Does God live like us? If God does not live like us, what is the difference between our living and God's living? These are the questions Adam addresses in his book, God Who Lives. So you can see right off that it's a very different agenda in this conversation than we usually have. So let's look at a little more detail. The book considers life as a conceptual problem, examining how new scientific studies about the emergence of life have critical implications for interpreting the religious symbol, God is living, and of course symbol is Tillich's term for theological language. That's a symbol. Adam suggests how absence and desire, so wonderful terms you don't usually see in a systematics, how absence and desire, which he takes from the wider literature and he terms it absential desire. So that's a typical Adam move to create a new term out of old ones, and by doing something more pithy. How absential desire are critical principles of life for scientific and philosophical thinking. Adam goes on to develop a constructive theological proposal in which the theological meaning of the symbol, God is living, is interpreted in terms of the insights garnered from the principle of absential desire. And he concludes that life is an absence, but an effective whole in relation to the material parts of which it is comprised. God is living is a similarly effective absence in relation to the whole. Now, if you know the work of Terry Deacon, anthropologist at UC Berkeley, you know that one of Terry's key insights is that you can have a causal mechanism in nature due to what's absent rather than present. And the image he always uses the hub at the center of the wheel. If you have a wheel you want to be rotating, it can't be fully solid. It's got to have a hole in the middle. And then that's where the axle is. As long as you have enough grease, it's going to rotate around the axle. But it's precisely the lack of wood of the wheel at the center, so it's the hole, which allows or even causes the uniform motion of the wheel. And that, just keep that little image in mind, because that's going to play throughout Adam's work, especially as he uses Terry Deacon. Okay, so it's a theory of causality in which what's absent is a cause, not just what's present. Okay, so it's more than formally efficient material and final causality, it's absential causality. And then he's going to use that in terms of the idea of desire. Right? And desire is based on an absence that you long for. And then he's going to use that to talk about God as present, as living, because God is in fact an absential whole. So it's a very complex, subtle, and imaginative argument. I really recommend if you like it, read the book. It's quite profound. So Adam uses two different methods in his approach to theology and science. Mine created interaction, and grateful for that. But in particular, Wenzel von Heusden, who has already been mentioned, who talks about transversality. Bensel means by this, the disciplines that you want to engage in are like people around a table. It's not a hierarchy, as in the classical mode, but it's really a conversation where each person around the table plays an essential but not exhaustive role. So you need everyone, and their interactions builds up a whole which is more than any one particular voice. In fact, that's always been arranged for me of what CPNS is. It's the goal of bringing the scientist to the table, to be part of an ongoing community, not to dominate, but to add something very essential. So Bensel has a very nice model of interdisciplinary work he calls transversality. Now I won't do more with that here, but I'm just going to sort of whet your appetite for what Bensel does. Bensel was Adam's professor, and he's been very close. So the central question is this. If we turn from the metaphor, the God who saves, right, kind of the standard classic symbol of the Christian faith, we believe in the God who saves, to that of the God who lives, we must radically expand our conceptual horizon from human, personal, and historical existence to the entire span of life on earth, not good, and perhaps the universe. So by moving from the God who saves, which just connotes, well, who needs salvation? Well, the human animal, and perhaps other non-human animals, right? Maybe chimpanzees. To the God who lives. Well, the scope now is, what, 3 billion years of life on Earth. It's wherever you want to say life originated. It's from then forward. That's the God we're going to talk about. Not just the God who saves tiny fragment of all creatures who ever lived. So one of his great instincts in his book is to say, we have 2 symbols. We use them all the time, liturgy, prayer, whatever. God who saves, God who lives. But the God who lives has an enormously wider cone, right, of jurisdiction, enormously wider domain of impact and relationality of relevance than just the God who saves. Unless you want to believe all creatures need salvation, and that's the other way you can go. And then he asks, what does this entail scientifically, philosophically, and theologically? We're just going to look at a tiny little bit of this tonight, just to give you a sense of it. So I'm just going to name 3 of the main philosophers in the scheme: Aristotle, Descartes, and Kant. And basically what he's doing in a detailed but pretty much overview of it is arguing that you're moving back and forth between 2 profound views of the world. Sung Ho mentioned these earlier. Basically a mechanical view of the world, sort of think causal closure and determinism, right? Contact forces. Versus a teleological explanation, right? A directional view of the world, a view in which you explain what is by what its future is. And so one of his main points in this book is that the theology and science conversation has gone back and forth, depending upon the science and philosophy dialogue part, from more mechanical, more mechanistic, right, more machine-like, images of nature, to more purpose-driven, right? The purpose of an acorn is to produce smoke. It's not a mechanical explanation, it's a teleological, purposeful. And he's going to try to combine those through his metaphor, the God who lives. Let me just grab a glass of water. Thanks, Henry. So, again, huge topic, but he does a lot of work with emergence theory, and he focuses on Terry Deacon again. Now, Terry is in a pitched battle with the philosopher Jung Kim, who is the nemesis to all of us who want to argue for a strong emergence, which means, in a nutshell, that a complex whole can have causal relations to its parts. So my mind can actually affect my brain. This is presupposed in Allen's argument, right? That you can have conversion either instant or over time, and that correlates with changes in brain states, and that there's an interaction between the 2. But Kim wants to argue against that. He wants to argue against emergence in the strong sense. And Terry Deacon wants to argue for it in the strong sense. And then Philip Clayton comes into that conversation. A lot of you know him from your own work in theology and science. I'm going to focus on Terry tonight. Oh, thanks. Kind of cold for 5 minutes. I can't shake it. It's hard to talk. So let's just focus briefly on Terry and his argument against Kim. Why do we care? Well, because if Terry can succeed, he can allow us to do our theological work in a much more profound way with science, without having the specter of reductionism, that is, any language about the whole, being fully reducible to dissolving into language about the parts, which we don't want to do. That'd be like saying any theological language of life could be fully reduced to mechanistic language about a closed causal process. We don't want to say that. So Kim's claim is that strong emergence of top-down causality, based on mereological whole-part reasoning, violates causal closure. That's a shorthand for saying if you frame the question of causality in terms of wholes and parts, right, like the parts of a machine, then you are necessarily going to lose the case for emergence and top-down causality, because the underlying level of nature, level of physics is close. It's all lockstep. So Kim's argument is that you can't have strong emergence. So you really can't have life. So to even get the conversation going about, well, what does science say about the metaphor of God as living, you're dead already, because living is evacuated of meaning by the very science you're trying to use. Now, it's not a science, it's a philosophical view of science. It's a scientific. But those two get, like oil and water, you stir them enough, they get mixed up. So Deacon takes it off. I think he succeeds. But to do so, he has a very complicated argument based on science. It's based on the science of the study of the origins of life. So he first shifts from object-based arguments, whole part, right? So I'm made of parts of my body, to a process perspective. I don't mean process matter, a dynamic perspective of processes in motion. He's going to argue for whole part causality in dynamic processes, like a whirlwind, right? The rings of Saturn. And he'll say there, amazingly, you can still obey causal closure. You're not violating physics. To say, how did the rings of Saturn form? You're not going to say, well, there's some agency at the ring level that moved the little pieces of moons around to form the rings. No, that would violate causal closure at the bottom. So he can preserve causal closure against Kim's claim he can, and still get top-down causality, because he's looking at a process which is sort of self-complexifying. So let's look at an example. Here's an example. The simplest kind is 3 kinds. Homeodynamics, and the idea is, why is the surface of water wet? Why can a mosquito sit on the surface and not sink? What's viscosity? And his argument is that viscosity, as an example of first-order emergence, is a property of the whole of the water. It's a property of the water in this glass. But it doesn't arise from the property of its parts. So each water molecule doesn't have a little property called wetness. And they all get together and they're wet. Right? It would be inappropriate to say a water molecule is wet. But it's very appropriate to say the 10 to 26 molecules together in an ensemble is wet. So it's an example of an emergent property, but of a process that is this liquid bouncing around this glass, not of an object like a glass. Now the second level, and I'm sure you've all seen this, you heat oil in a skillet, and you get these little vortices that form in the oil. It's a beautiful phenomenon. They're called Bernard cells. Typically, the little hexagons whose structure reflects the boundary condition of the circular pan calls this morphodynamics. And it's precisely the fact that the bottom of the pan, sorry, the oil in the bottom of the pan is hotter than the oil on the top of the pan. So it expands. Because it expands, it's lighter, so it rises. And the most efficient way to rise is through a vortex. So it forms a vortex. Not because, God says, let there be a vortex. It's not a top-down cause. But it is a top-down cause in the sense that the vortex structure causes the individual oil molecules to move in spirals. So it's pulled apart, top-down. And it's caused by the overall problematic of hot at the bottom, cold at the top. Hot means expand, and therefore move upwards and displace the colder fluid at the top. So that whole combination of processes and areas are very complicated terms for which I'm not going to bother you with. Terry loves to make up little terms for these things. So you need to read him with a kind of dictionary on one side. But that's what he's really saying. He's saying this is a good example of a more complex problem than the emergence of liquidity. It's the emergence of complexity, or if you call it self-organization or autocohesion, self-complexification. The third level, really interesting, and this is where he would say you have something that's proto-living. You're basically either there or almost there with what you call a primitive form of life. This is a set of two autocatalytic processes. So A and B, chemicals A and B produce chemical C. Chemical D, and there's supposed to be E there, so D and E, produce F. But then C catalyzes the DE reaction to produce F, and F catalyzes the AB reaction to produce C. Now, if you can contain that in an envelope sometimes, so you in an area of the fluid where that's prevalent, then that process continues on its own. It doesn't depend upon there being like energy at the bottom of the pot, of the flame, that heats the water and it causes it to expand. This is a self-contained or autonomic process in which the complexity of two catalytic processes, each reciprocally catalyzing the other process, it simply occurs. It occurs on its own, and it produces. The only constraint is the availability of the A and B and the C and the D and E elements, molecules. Once they're used up, it stops. But it isn't dependent upon an external source like the flame. So here's his diagram. You've probably seen this if you read this book, Incomplete Nature. Here's his diagram for how, in order to get teleodynamics, which he says, e.g. life, grant that's a huge philosophical leap, but at least he's getting close to what we mean by life, right? Is dependent upon the presence of morphodynamics. Those are the individual chemical reactions. And that's dependent upon homodynamics, that is the fact that entropy is involved in the processes that are stated. Okay, that's all the science of Deacon and Adam will show you. Let's switch to theology. Life is an attribute of God. He's going to parse it out in terms of two terms. I talked about absentia desire before. He's also going to talk about relationality. Braden and Sun Ho talk about relationality a lot in their presentations. Alan talked about desire and false desire. He reviews Barth, Moltmann, Zilius, Simon Fay, Timo Bale, and Paul Tillich. I'm going to focus on Tillich briefly, just to give you a sense of what he says about Tillich. Each of these people give him theological resources for the idea of life as this limbic term that spans, or to use Van Hoysting terms, as a transversal term between the context of science and the context of theology proper. It's the shared concept, so it's good for the theology and science conversation from Benzel's transversality method. And he's going to say that Tillich uses the phrase dynamic flesh. This is really Adam's working with Tillich It would take an hour to go through Tillich and see how he gets it from Tillich and how much he retranslates, reconfigures Tillich, and how much it's a fair presentation of Tillich. But I just invite you to take this as a really great example of a really good scholar who really knows Tillich, right? And he's able to, work with Tillich and come up with this argument. So the first claim he makes for Tillich is that living beings always include their own negation. Living beings are always dying beings. And you can see already how the notion of desire comes into that, because it's a desire for life. That is always a threat to a living being, because it's not given by themselves. It's not necessary to their existence. It's a gift. Or another way of saying is, we're contingent. Or another way of saying is, we're always dying. Or at the edge of death. Life incurs the conditions of estrangement as a mix of essential and essential being. This is a standard Tillichian move. Right? Tillich will say that what's actual, right? This actual instrument, is a combination of essential and existential being, or is the translation from essential to existential being that is involved with actuality. And then he'll talk about Tillich's multidimensional unity of being represents the essential elements, and the conflict between dimensions represents the ambiguity of essential being. What Grady was referring to as the fall or sin, and others have referred to that tonight. That notion of fall is a way of talking about what Tillich means by estrangement. For Tillich, it's universal, there's no fall, but it's real. There's no unestranged being, and that's all involved with the actuality of existential being from essential being. All of that gives Adam kind of grist for the mill for his notion of, to talk about God as living, is talk about what he calls dynamic flesh. You can see it, incarnational peace, or someone mentioned that earlier himself. And then finally, he says life as the motion from potential to actual being applies symbolically to God as the ground of life. Again, his big picture is honor but not use God as the ground of being language. I'd rather use God as living language, see what I can do with that to relate science and theology. And he's succeeding by talking about God's living as a kind of dynamic flesh, which again is his term. He's getting from Tillich. God is the ontological meaning of desire or flesh, and this connects to emergence theory. So let's look at his conclusions and I'll stop for a couple questions. Again, Adam coins this term from Deacon and Tillich, so it's already a synthetic term, dynamic flesh, which refers to looking at a dynamic process rather than an object-oriented problematic. So remember, his emergence deals not with emergent properties of objects, but with emergent properties of processes. So that's why he used the word dynamic. And flesh, because he's looking at life, and as said already, the key idea of incarnation is that the Logos becomes sarx, flesh, not just human. And so he's looking at the context of life much more broadly than human life, where sin and salvation might be adequate, to a much more general notion of life as a self, a manifestation of the estrangement of life, which is the constant dying of life. So it's the dynamics of flesh. He's talking about life as radically dependent, that you can't think of key work in and of himself, that's it, adequate to my knowledge of key work. No, it's essential I know who you are in yourself, but I also need to know who you are in your relation to everyone else. So it's always dependent. It's always, in fact, life is radically dependent. A great example from the station today was just the fact that, again, if one cell encompasses the second cell, you now have a new cell that already is internalized what used to be an external relation of the other cell. Life is always manifesting or manifested. He uses manifesting because someone usually uses participles, right? Jesus Christ is manifesting of the essential God relation, God-human relation, and the kindred spirit. Life is always manifesting as desire. So desire for Adam is essential to the meaning of life. That will allow him to talk about the great tradition in which the explanation for God's creating the world isn't just an ontological one, that necessary being overflows, but it's really a description of will, that God loves, and love is an externalizing of God's self. So life is a manifestation of desire, the desire to communicate God's self. So instead of just speaking of creation as ground of being, you're speaking of life in terms of desire. It's a different language. It's kind of like, my wonderful Korean students, you're amazing how you speak English and Korean. It's just different languages. What I think Adam's doing is actually learning the language of Deacon and those folks, and he knows the language of Christian theology. And he's going back and forth. And I find it very hard to read, because he knows Deacon a lot better than I do. But I get what his aim is, and it's a gorgeous aim, and it's a heroic, task, he said, from himself. And so he finally ends with this notion that there's something intrinsically tragic and poetic and moving about the way in which desire is the result of a cause, and the cause is absence. So absence becomes a cause, the whole in the will. Absence becomes a cause. Okay?
We should start right now.
Okay, I'll finish up. Absence is a cause pointing in the direction of desire. And so it's absential desire that is at least one central characterization of what living means. It's a beautiful thing. In sum, life is an absent but effective whole in relation to the material parts of which it is comprised. God as living is a similarly effective absence in relation to will. So thank you, Adam.